Okay guys, so this is day 2 of the lectures that I've been making. Today we actually started out day 2 with let's talk about cavities, and I have the little funny picture up there with a tooth that has a cavity in it. I do not mean cavities that we get in our teeth. When I say cavities, I actually mean the spaces in the body that contain organs. So anytime you hear cavities in anatomy and physiology, it's the latter part that you need to think about. So right now, here's a picture of more or less all of the cavities that we have in the body. And I know this picture just kind of thrown at you is pretty intimidating, just because there's lots of, words all over the place and lines pointing to different sectors and whatnot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go more or less region by region and help you guys kind of navigate through the body cavities. So for starters, we're going to start with the ventral cavity. And anytime you hear the word ventral, it simply means the front side. So the picture that's on the screen is the entire ventral cavity. And I started with this cavity because it's the largest one by volume, and it contains 2 subcavities, I guess you can say. So the first cavity within it is actually this upper part up here. That is actually the thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity holds 3 subcavities in between. So first off, we have the purple coloration, which represents the pleural cavities, and the pleural cavities is what actually holds your lungs. Anytime you hear the word pleural, it always means lung. The next cavity that's down is we have the pericardial cavity. Now this cavity is actually the cavity that holds your heart, and the last one within the thoracic cavity is the mediastinum, which is up here. The next cavity that we have within the ventral cavity is the abdominopelvic cavity, and I made the joke that the abdominopelvic cavity is kind of like the celebrity couples that merge their name together. We have like what, Brad Pitt and Angelina make Brangelina, something like that. The abdominopelvic cavity is very similar in the sense that it has the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity in it. And if you take abdominal and pelvic and kind of merge those names together, that's what makes the abdominopelvic. So the pink part of the picture is the abdominal cavity, and the green part is the pelvic. And of course, the entirety of the two together make the abdominopelvic. And these cavities, the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavity, are actually separated by the diaphragm, which is kind of like this thin line that you see separating the two. The next cavity that we talked about is the dorsal cavity, and this is actually, every time you hear the word dorsal, I want you to think of back side, or the back of you. And the dorsal cavity is a lot smaller than the ventral cavity in the sense that it only has 2 subcavities to it. It has the cranial cavity, which is the big orange part up here, which holds your brain, and then it has the vertebral cavity, which ultimately is your spinal cord, okay? So your spinal cord that runs all the way down, that is more or less your vertebral cavity. It holds the spinal cord in there. We also have facial cavities, and so I'm going to go, this is the facial cavities kind of in its entirety, but I'm going to go ahead and go to the next page that shows things a little bit more in detail. So within the face, we have the frontal sinuses, which is actually your front part in your forehead. It's this part right here. The frontal sinuses are sometimes what gets congested during cold and flu season. When you guys feel like you have a tension headache, those frontal sinuses tend to fill up with some fluid and some pressure. And so, again, frontal sinuses are kind of above like your eyebrow. The next one down is the orbital cavities, and the orbital cavities is actually what holds your eyes. You can feel the orbital cavities if you kind of just feel around in your face. You can kind of feel a circle around your eye where the bone kind of meets the cavity. You can kind of feel the hollowing out of the bone that creates that cavity, and so that's the orbital cavity. The next one is the nasal cavity. And more or less, anytime you hear the word nasal, most of us know that means your nose. Your nose is kind of like the pathway to the nasal cavity. Down from there, we have the oral cavity. Again, oral meaning mouth. So again, the mouth is the pathway to this cavity, this oral cavity. And the last kind of a cavity that you have in your face that is not necessarily as obvious is what we call the sphenoidal cavity. And that's kind of right behind the orbital cavity, kind of tucked in there. And so that's the sphenoidal cavity. The last one, more or less on our head, or our what we consider the facial cavity, is the middle ear cavity, which is this little purple part right in here. It's actually all the way in there, and your ear canal is what leads you to the middle ear cavity. So in class, I went ahead and had you guys map this out just to make more or less a concept map to help you remember what cavity goes to what bigger cavity goes to what. I know it can get really confusing sometimes. So I went ahead and I already have my concept map made out. You guys again did this in class, but just for time purposes, I already have one prepared. So here it is. We got our main category, which in essence is body cavities, right up here. And I said within the body cavities, we kind of have three main ones. We have the ventral cavities, the dorsal cavities, and the facial cavities. And so starting with the ventral cavity, I had said that it is made up of kind of two subcavities after that. The first being the thoracic cavity that holds your pericardium cavity, your mediastinum cavity, and then your pleural cavity. Down from the thoracic cavity within the ventral cavity is the abdominopelvic cavity. And again, abdominopelvic is easy to remember because it has both of its subcavities in its name. So the first cavity being abdominal cavity, and then the second one being pelvic. The last of the major body cavities is, like I said, facial cavity. And we have 6 within the facial cavity, 6 subcavities. One being the nasal cavity. We have the middle ear cavity. We have the frontal sinuses, the sphenoidal cavity, the orbital cavity, and the oral cavity. So this is more or less all of our cavities kind of mapped out and how they relate to each other. When I say concept maps, always remember that we start big in general, and we kind of move to like more specific or more sub. So always grand and then to get more small. After the cavities, we had talked about membranes, and what I want you guys to think about when you think of the word membrane, I want you to think of like a sheath or a lining. I have a picture of a painter's drop cloth. Many of you guys, if you've ever painted, you know that you put down a drop cloth around the furniture that you do not want paint to get on it. It's kind of like a lining, and you have membranes that do the same for your organ. They more or less line them. So within membranes, the topic of membranes, we have what we call serous membranes. And these serous membranes are called so because they actually contain serous fluid. And this serous fluid is just kind of some slippery, it's kind of slimy. It more or less looks sort of kind of like phlegm, I guess you could say. And this fluid is really important because it serves as a shock absorber. So if for whatever reason you were to get punched in the stomach or something like that, if the membrane that surrounds your stomach or things like that should have a serous fluid within it, and that fluid more or less acts as a shock absorber of the blow so that it doesn't do any internal damage within your organs. Membranes have two sides to them. The first being the visceral layer. Visceral layer is what actually touches the organ, so it's kind of like the inner layer of the membrane. The next layer is what we call the parietal layer, and it's the one that's on the outside. It's the layer that more or less touches the cavity or the wall of whatever is around the organ. I gave an example of a picture. So we have our heart up here, and surrounding our heart we have our pericardium membrane. It kind of almost looks like a plastic baggie around the heart. And I know the picture's a little blurry, but if you zoom in, the first part of the outside of this membrane is what we call, of course, the parietal pericardium, which is what this picture is showing here. Of course, the inner part of this membrane is the visceral pericardium, and this is the one that's actually physically touching the heart. And in between the visceral layer and the parietal layer, we actually have this fluid, okay? This fluid, and again, the fluid is in order to act as a shock absorber, just in case any blow were to happen to this particular organ.